Hello and welcome back to Stu Structures. I am Mark Stewart, your favorite Pharaoh equestrianologist, and we're here to continue with video 5 in the series of building the freight house, so stay tuned. Okay, so continuing on with the freight house, there's a lot of things we have to look at. By the time this video is done, I'd like to have answers as to how I'm going to finish the brick archways above the windows, and also that brick dental work. I'd like to have a solution to that problem as well. Other things to start thinking about. We need to start thinking about the second story building that adds on to this. I want to put that on before I start the roof work and the platforms and all that type of a thing. So we'll start thinking about that as well. We have to add on all the rest of those panels around the building for the door panels and those little 2-foot wide panels that go up between the window panels. Some of them are on the corners. We need to do 45s on those to make nice corners that looks like the brick wraps around it. So we're just going to jump into all this and get started. So let's go. Okay, the first thing I'm probably going to work on is the rest of these panels for around the building. See, we did finish this first side in the first video, but I'm just going to clamp all these door panels on and come back and mark the openings for those so I can cut these out. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth in this because I did it in the previous video, but basically once I clamp them on and mark them, the edges with a knife here, I just come back, I cut out the main panel first in the center of the door because I can reuse this piece of plastic later on. It's a good sized panel and I don't want to waste it. And then I come back and nibble out the arch and use an X-Acto knife to just go ahead and clean up the edges so that it has, a fairly decent fit. And then I glue it into place, matching up with the opening that was there previously, and once it's glued, clamp it in place for a little bit so that it can dry up. Now remember, in one of these doors I cut out the brick archway above one of the doors, and behind this panel I want a filler piece now to level out with the door panel behind, since I'm going to do the brick on top of those pieces. So then I just go through and do all the door panels, and basically this shot just shows all the door panels in place. Now I will come back with the files and just file the inside edges so that it looks like one really thick piece of plastic versus two pieces of plastic glued together. But basically that's all the door pieces in place. So we're going to have to come back now and do all these real thin 2-foot wide pieces. Remember, there are some on the corners that I have to bevel and put 45 degree edges on so that they meet up so that the brick seams wrap the corners. And the rest of them just glue into place between the window panels. And this is just that once that's finished. Now there are some seams I'm going to have to come back when I paint and just drag some paint into to fill some slight little tiny gaps, but basically this is the whole basic structure with all the relief in place. And you can see here that filler piece that I put in that doorway where I cut that arch piece out before I changed my mind of how I was going to do this building. The next thing I'm going to work on is this ledge that goes underneath the windows. It's hard to really see it here, but there's a 2-brick ledge that goes all the way across that panel, and then right underneath the window itself is actually a concrete windowsill. Now I have this real thin plastic brick sheet. The bricks are slightly larger than the brick that I'm using from these Walter sheets, but the thickness is what I really need, and I don't think it's going to be that noticeable, the difference in brick thickness. So anyway, so I come back and cut 2 brick strips of this, and this will act as the ledge that goes across the entire panel. So what I do is just take these strips and lay them in place, because there's slight variances in each of these panels. I don't just want to cut them all because some may be long, some may be short. So I'm going to individually just lay these in place and cut every single one of these as an individual piece, and then glue them into place, and just work my way around the building doing all of these. And then here's just the picture of the first one glued into place. And then we'll come back and do these across every single one of these window panels. The door panels don't get these in them, but here's just a view of the building once all those little windowsill areas are in place. Now this does have, brick under the window as well, which, would have been concrete. So I've got to think of a way to do that. So what I'm going to do is I cut all this paper here 4 foot wide, which is the width of the windows, and cut it to length. And that way I can cut back and cut individual pieces that will wrap over that brick and into the windowsill to create that concrete piece, because it actually does stick out just a little bit from the brick too. So I cut enough of these pieces to do every window, and then I come back and glue them to the top of the window sills, and I'm going to let that set up before I come back and bend them down over the brick and glue them to the face of the brick, and then we'll cut all that off and trim it as needed. So here's just a picture once that had set up. I came back and added some glue to the brick underneath and bent that paper down. And just, I had to work with each of these just a few seconds to get them to really set up. And then I came back with a knife and just used that plastic brick edge underneath to come through and cut off the paper that overlapped so that it was even with the bottom of the brick ledge. So it looks like this is just a separate concrete piece in the middle of that whole brick ledge. So the next thing we're going to start working on are all these brick archways over the main doors and the small windows. And I showed in my previous video some things that I had experimented with. I really like adding the real thin layer of paper to as an individual brick above these better than anything. But one thing I did think about, and it came across in some of my stuff, there's this no-tear paper that we used in the nursery years ago just because it withstands weather really good, but it has some plastic, qualities to it, and it's somewhat flexible, and it's as thin as paper. So I came back and measured the brick in the wall and then cut these real long strips the width of an individual brick. And then I dug out the chopper and, just basically chopped a bunch of brick. And I'm just going to add them onto the building one by one. I tried cutting individual archways and then cutting the brick once the archways were glued in place. But the mortar lines just, they're just not quite right. So the only way that I can think of to really do this is just to go ahead and add the bricks individually. This is going to be a tedious process, but I just think it gives me the best end result. So the best way to lay these out, because you need to make sure all the angles in the arches are going to work out right. So what I'm going to do is make a couple of templates, one for the doors and one for the windows that I can put in place, so as I lay these brick, I can get all the angles right. So I laid these circles out and drew my lines out from the center point of that, and then I cut out the areas of the paper that will sit down onto where the brick will go. Then I can just tape these onto the face with the bottom of that arch lined up with the door or the window arch, and then come back and just start laying, put a layer of glue down, just a real thin layer, and then come back and start laying all these individual brick pieces. Now this it was a process. It's very tedious. It started out really slow to begin with. I got these first couple windows done here. You can also see I went ahead and put the concrete above the big square door as well. And then I came back and did a couple more archways, and by this point, it's starting to roll along pretty well. I mean, it's not perfect, but I think it's going to work all right. So now we need to start thinking about how we're going to do this dental work. And basically there are 3 bricks that step up to the face of the final brick on front from the brick layer down below. And we didn't put as much plastic between the layers, so I don't have the depth to work with as much as I have here. So I'm using a real thin photo paper to do this with, and this is basically how I'm going to lay it out. I'm going to cut 2 long strips and glue 2 brick strip on the bottom with a 1 brick wide strip on top of that, and then I'm going to add on layers of brick. The bottom layer will be 2 bricks wide that sticks out from that bottom sheet. Then the next layer is 2 bricks wide, and it will set out half of that sheet below and will sit back onto the 2 brick strip that I have there. And then the bricks that go on top of that will be 2 individual bricks that one will set on the single brick strip that I glued onto the 2 brick strip, and then there'll be an extra brick that will glue onto the 2 brick pad that we put from the bottom coming up. So it's just a process of layers and putting all these together. So I measured my strips and got my widths and cut all the individual brick strips, and we'll go from there. So here's just the first 2 strips. Now one strip is 2 bricks tall and the other is 1 strip tall, and I glue the 1 strip on top of this 2 strip wide one and you know, create kind of a stair step. Now this goes all the way across underneath all this dental work. And then I come back and glue the second layer onto that bottom step top. And this is just the easiest way to start building this out. And I glue all 8 of those on, and then I come back, and on the bottom of those I glue the bottom layer, which sits back underneath of that and leaves 1 brick exposed, and it comes up to that second layer. And then I come back and glue, you know, the top layer on, and you know, then I'm to the point that I need to start adding the individual brick layers to the top of that. So I cut the pads in top and just add individual bricks for the top 2 layer, and then we have a dental work. Now, you know, I made this a little bit long because I want to cast it long, because these panels are a little different in width, so I can cut them down to size as I use them. And I decided I'm going to go ahead and mold these instead of just making all these individually. So I made a styrene little mold box here, and I took some tacky glue and just glued that to the bottom, and then we'll go ahead and make a rubber mold for this. Now every time I mold, I like to have a little extra mold sitting aside to mold other things. And one thing I'm going to need down the future are just tons of these worktops with tables and stuff with tools on them for the roundhouse and various places on the layout. So, you know, these are old wooden tables that have slats, wood tops with holes down through them and quite worn. So what I'm going to do here is fill these with this putty so that I don't get the mold rubber going down through the table and making it impossible to demold. And then I'm going to come back and then glue these in a couple more mold boxes like I made for the other thing. And then we'll make all 3 of these molds, and then we can start mixing up the resins to pour the molds. Remember, I also have the molds from the previous building that I did. It has barrels, crates, and you know, 55-gallon drums that I can use as well. So we've got plenty of things to mold for scenery details to use up any extra resin that we may have. So there we have another segment of Stu's Structures. I appreciate you coming back and joining me for this. You know, we're finding answers and solutions to some of the problems with this building. Not that they were problems, it's just a matter of taking the time to figure out how to do things. So when you're building a building for yourself and scratch building, you know, sometimes it's an experimental thing. You know, I've tried many different methods to work on those arches. I think once I come back and just trim the brick edges so that they're perfectly rounded over the top of the arch, and I can file the under edge to make sure everything's perfectly even under there. And you know, the brick, because I hand cut all these, there is some slightly different sizes in the brick, and as they're white on this wall, you can see a lot of that stuff is very noticeable. But once we get all the brick painted the same color and get some mortar lines in it and other stuff, it's not going to be visibly, you know, that bad. It's not going. You're not really going to notice it at all, actually. So, you know, I'm pleased with where this is all going. So it's nice to be able to get underway with some of those arches. It's going to take a while to do those. After the 4th one, I am getting a little quicker with them. So it won't take as long as I originally thought it was going to. And the dental work, You know, I could hand make all those as well for this building, but there's a couple of things on this building that I'm going to have to mold, and I just decided just to go ahead and mold all these. And you notice I left them a little bit long because the widths of the panels where they go up in the top of and that one door are just a little variance in sizes, so that'll allow me to trim them to size so that everyone will fit nice and snug. So we're just going to mold these with rubber and then cast them in resin, and I made the extra molds. It's nice making, every time you cast something you have a little extra resin, you just do. So you need to have a lot of these other molds of things that you're going to need in the future anyway. So every time you have a little bit of resin, you're not throwing it out. You're going ahead and using it to make details and scenery and stuff for other projects that you're going to need them for in the future. I mean, I model mostly the steam era, so wooden barrels and wooden crates and even 55-gallon drums were coming around during that period of time. And I'm just going to need tons of those for this layout when I get started building the layout. So I made those when I made the molds for the beaneries. We built it, and these tabletops with the tools on them in the roundhouse. I mean, it's 24 stalls, and there's tables with tools on them in the majority of that roundhouse. So I'm going to need tons of these. And at the rip track buildings out at the other end, there's going to be needed a few in those. And little shops in town that work on cars or whatever, you can always use tabletops with tools and stuff on them. So anyway, you're always going to need, just bunches of these little tabletops with tools on them. So now we've got molds, and we'll just start making them. I might not make enough now for what I need eventually, but every time I mold some of these parts for this building, I'll make a few. It's not that big a deal. So anyway, like I said earlier, thanks back for coming back and watching my videos with me. I do appreciate you spending your time doing this. I hope you learned something. If anything else, just what not to do. You might think of better ways to do things that work better for you. And when you're building buildings, it's all an individual thing. Some things work for some people, they don't for others. So you have to do what works for you. Experiment with things and learn. I experiment with things all the time. I've not done it all. There's a lot that I still have to learn building buildings, but that if you don't go out there and do it, you're not going to learn. You can watch people do it all you want to, but sometimes it takes hands-on to actually figure out what works for you. So anyway, like and subscribe. There's a little red button below this. Subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell next to it, and then you'll be notified every time a video comes out. And we've still got several to go in this series, but I've got other buildings to build and other things I want to work on, and some trains and real life stuff that I want to film and put videos out there. So you'll be notified every time some of that comes out. Play with your trains, build some buildings, scratch build some stuff, learn and have fun, and happy model railroading.